Everybody's situated well enough to see a screen and whatnot. Here's a reading list if you want to study up just things that we collectively thought might be interesting, useful. Welcome to this joint venture that we've cooked up here on death, dying, and grieving. Although we're not going to go in that order, we're going to deal with grieving first, and I guess more or less dying next week, and some death issues around the ritual practices of grieving, funerals, and whatnot. That'll be week 3. But today we're going to explore grief and grieving. Let's see. Let's start with a prayer from my favorite book of prayers. Some of you have heard me use this before, Gorillas of Grace. The late Ted.
He was Nancy's pastor.
My pastor in Philadelphia. Yep.
Wow. Ted Lowe, whose brother actually was one of my graduate school professors. He was a person who himself was acquainted with grief. Heard him speak once. He came to the seminary, told us his story. Won't go totally into that at the moment, but he has these poetic sort of prayers that bring a lot of praise and joy, but also are in touch with the really deep things of life. So he gave a title to this prayer. It's called "I Teeter on the Brink of Endings." And when we're talking about grieving, we're always talking about things that come to an end and that we have lost. So let us pray. O God of endings, you promised to be with me always, even to the end of time. Move with me now in these occasions of last things, of shivering vulnerabilities and letting go of parents gone, past gone, friends going, old self growing, letting go of children grown, needs outgrown, prejudices ingrown, illusions overgrown, letting go of swollen grudges and shrunken loves. Be with me in my end of things, my letting go of dead things, dead ways, dead words, dead self I hold so tightly, defend so blindly, fear losing so frantically. I teeter on the brink of endings. Some anticipated, some resisted, some inevitable, some surprising, most painful. And the mystery of them quiets me to awe. In silence, Lord, I feel now the curious blend of grief and gladness in me over the endings that the ticking and whirling of things brings. And I listen for your leading to help me faithfully move on through the fear of my time to let go, so the timeless may take hold of me. Amen. Okay. Let me just start with this thought. I forget who said this, but it summarizes everything. Grief is the cost of commitment. Think about that. Grief is the cost of commitment. And another truth from Carl Rogers, who was a well-known psychotherapist back in the 60s. Carl Rogers was famous for saying, what is most personal in the end is most general. And what that means is, for me, that as we dig deep into our own stories of loss and grief, and understand what, everyone is unique to each of us, but we understand our own story better about the commitments we made and what we've lost when those commitments have to end. The deeper we go into our own story, the more we are connected with all of humanity. It's like there's a groundwater that we all drink out of, and grief is a shared universal experience. And so we're not going to ask people to share deeply of your own personal stuff. You only share as much as you want. But just know that as we go deep into our own story, that's not an act of narcissism and over self-focused and whatnot. We're really getting in touch with the groundwater that we all that feeds all of us. I think that's my take on this anyway. Um, so everybody's grief is unique, and yet there's so much that we have in common. And here's the hope for objective out of today that we, or maybe two. One is that we get an appreciation for the fact that all of life involves loss, and all loss deserves to be grieved. Death is one kind of loss, but it's not the only loss. We're going to talk about numerous kinds of loss and so forth. Some I'm sure we've thought of, some probably never thought of. Um, but when we're well, so first acknowledging grief and that all loss deserves grief, and secondly, that the object of working through our grief is to eventually come to the place where we can remember with less pain. We don't grieve in order to forget, because it's impossible, and if you try to, it will always be there anyway. But it is possible to remember over time with less pain. Or another way to say that is one therapist I know says, you work toward reconciling the loss, helping that loss find its proper place in your story. And we'll talk a little bit about what the passage of time and the idea that time heals everything is maybe sort of true, but there are issues with that. Okay. Um, let's see. I'm going to see if I got. No, I can't do it. All right, next slide. You got it.
Grief is the normal but bewildering cluster of ordinary human emotions arising in response to a significant loss, intensified and complicated by the relationship to the person or the object lost.
Yes. So let me just parse that out for a minute. Grief is normal. Although when we're experiencing it and when it's intense grief over a really, really significant loss, it does not feel normal. It feels like we're going crazy. It feels like nothing is normal. It's like every day is unexpected misery. And then we're surprised by a day when we're not feeling as bad as we think we should feel. But it is a normal human experience. But it is also bewildering because it is a cluster of feelings and emotions. Some folks say, well, grief is a feeling. No, grief is a combination of a lot of different things. Some because it's unique to each of us. Some feel more of this. Some feel more of that. Some grief involves sadness. Grief involves anger. Grief involves despair, frustration, all kinds of things. And these are ordinary human emotions. It can feel like when we're in a grief process that anger is out of control. Why did this happen? Why did God let this happen? Why did this person break up with me? Why did I get fired? I mean, but that's normal. This is not a weird emotion that came, somewhere. It's one of a whole cluster of things. And these emotions are felt specifically in response to a significant loss. Now we have, you lost your car keys or something. Okay, it's still a loss if they're permanently lost, but that's not maybe the most significant loss. But again, what's significant for me might not be that significant for you. You lose pet, you lose some painting that you had in the house. Didn't mean anything to you, but for me, it was a big deal. But so it's a significant loss. And then lastly, the experience of grief, there we go, is always intensified and complicated by the nature of the relationship with whatever it is that we lost. So, some acquaintance may die, person we knew at work, we go to the funeral, it's a loss, but not going to be with us probably for the rest of the year. A parent dies or a child dies, and those things are, among the most significant experiences of loss that we can have. But again, not my place to tell anybody what is significant for them. You can determine that for yourself. So let me just throw out a question here. I'm be interested in some responses. What what are some of the ordinary human emotions that you've experienced in the wake of a loss that you may have had? And if you want to mention what the loss is, that might be useful too.
Since my wife died just 2 weeks ago, um, several things. I'm still processing it, but like I'm surprised how often in these 2 weeks something has happened, and I said, "Oh, I gotta be sure and tell Ruth about it." Oh, and then you realize.
Yeah, yeah.
There was also a great deal of relief because I'd seen how she had declined, and the quality of her life was so poor
Yeah.
that I just could hardly stand it. And so I was glad for her that she was spared any further decline.
And that's why grief involves a cluster of emotions, not just what we sometimes think of as negative emotions, but relief, gratitude. Yeah. Others, are some of the ordinary human emotions you may have experienced in your grief process.
Well, I think we're all grieving the food giveaway.
Yeah, okay.
And it's like disbelief and like it's kind of our identity.
Yeah.
So,
And we're going to name some specific losses in a little bit, but you've landed on a very significant one. When we have some loss of identity, well, nobody died, but that's a very big deal. That this is part of what comes with retirement and the grief work that's often necessary. Uh, it's inevitable. I mean, nobody took it away from you, or well, if you got fired, I suppose it's a different matter. But if you chose to retire, you chose to set aside that, and or that's helpful. Others,
I'll just say, after my husband died, maybe a year later, I was just so angry because he knew how to do everything. He fixed the computer after I didn't know how to get into anything. And I would just rail against him.
yeah. Um, and my guess is you probably said in the next 5 minutes, this makes no sense. Why am I directing my anger? And yet,
Why do I care?
but
That I got madder.
yeah, yeah, that's not going to fix anything. But to give expression because it's normal to have those things happen. Yeah. What else?
When
Yeah.
my mother died in January, and it was not until the following December that the grief and anger really hit me because she did not walk through the door with the cookies for Christmas that were perfect, and one tray of cookies decorated with the red sugar and one with the green sugar. And I was sitting at the dining room table getting ready for Christmas dinner, and I cried for 45 minutes. And it was 11 months after her death. And it was so odd.
Can you identify? That's powerful experience. Can you put a name to what was the loss that you experienced? What?
She would, well, no cookies.
Okay. What did that mean to you?
She was not going to be there at Christmas dinner.
Yeah.
And she was my mother was a very shy person. So she didn't insert herself into, and we had some personalities in my family, and she did not insert herself, but she was always so present with, like, where are the cookies? Where's Jane? She was missed.
Yeah. Wow. Um. Well, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
That was me. I don't know if you saw my hand. I was
Stand
gonna
up.
say another emotion I was gonna share is regret.
Okay, yeah.
When my dad died, kind of like with Ruth, he was not living the life you wanted to see him live and all that stuff, and we knew he was dying. And yet, when I had memories of him, certain triggers, you think, "Gosh, why didn't I like ask him more stories,
Yeah.
or why didn't I let him know how much I learned from him about this?" Like a regret of maybe not appreciating him more.
Yeah. And what makes for a really significant loss is when you know it's final. And death brings that reality. There's not going to be any more opportunity to sit around the table, to ask the questions, to have the experience, to conjure the memories. It's the finality. Now, there's also, we'll talk about this in a minute, ambiguous grief, when you think it's over, but it's not totally clear. Different things play into that. But well, this carry this on a little farther. I want to, what have you experienced as things that made it particularly hard to deal with a significant loss? And on the other hand, also, what has helped you deal with a significant loss? Let's deal with the hard stuff first. Let's do the hard things first. What have you experienced that made it hard to get to a place where you could remember with less pain, or to reconcile the loss and kind of put it in its rightful place? What has messed with your grief process?
Emptying and selling a house.
Oh, God.
Say more. I mean,
Well, it took us 3 years to empty my mother's house.
okay. And you had some feelings about that, I imagine.
Well, we had 2 young boys.
Yeah.
No, we had 1. Yeah. It was just with Matthew. She lived in Dayton. We lived here. And there was no one else.
And
No,
you gotta do it, right? There's no,
And then we couldn't sell it. And so the house has now been torn down.
Oh, gosh.
they've lost that. Yeah. So there's stuff that has to be done that you don't have the time to spend on the things you might want to spend your emotional energy on. You got to do that for sure. Other things that you've experienced making grief hard thing?
When my sister and I had to empty my mother's house, it was sad and hysterical at the same time. We cried and we laughed and we cried and we laughed. When we found the packing box full of rubber bands,
Yeah,
we had to sit on the kitchen floor and laugh because it was just
that's good.
to say to you that my mother never got over the depression is like a tiny
Yeah.
thing. But so if I could catalog the laughing and the crying
Yeah.
that went on that day, it would be a book.
Yeah.
But the rubber bands were the low point, high point of the day.
Yeah, maybe bump the next slide up there, which just has these 2 questions. So I think that's what made it hard to hit it again, and maybe what's helped. My former home pastor, actually it was his daughter, told me it's time after he died. He visited a couple's home after the husband had died and the wife eventually died, adult kids. They found on a shelf a little box with a label on it that said, this is classic, string too short to use. Okay?
Related to my mother.
Yeah, exactly.
You never know.
There's some kind of song in that somewhere, but it's
Stop.
yeah. Well, a little thing like that could perfectly sum up someone's personality, and then you realize, yeah, they were really quirky, but no, they're not, they're gone, anything in particular that's helped you deal with a loss?
I think this is both hard and helped. Um, having a small child.
Mm.
So like when our cat
Oh.
was dying, cat was 18 and Miles was, well, it was like, math is hard. I think he was 7.
Yeah.
And we had, the cat was sick and we had planned to take him to be euthanized, but he got sicker overnight and I could tell that he was going to pass away before the vet. And so I told him, I think, Miles, like, I think this is going to happen. Do you want to be here when it does? And he said, okay. all right, well, then you should say goodbye, you know. And then he did, and then it turned out that the cat died in my arms, um, which was interesting. Um, you know, then we had to, that was not his first experience with death. He had unfortunately been to a couple of funerals before then. Um, so it made it hard because I had to be the grown up. I had to, you know, but we were able to talk about, you know, these sad things or whatever, but it also made it easier because we were doing it together. We were able to process together. Um, and that just a really sweet little story because then when we did go to like, what do I do with this carcass now?
Yeah.
I would live in an apartment. It's not like I could just like go out back and
Yeah.
dig him a little. And so I called the vet and I said, what do I do? And they said, well, bring him in and, you know, we can cremate him or whatever. So we wrapped him up and put him in a, like, you know, in his favorite blanket and put him in a box and whatever. And Miles said, I want to carry him. And so he was really, his back was straight. He was walking into this like, and he said him very gently on the counter. He's like, this is my cat, Mendelssohn. And he died today, and I need you to take care of him. And he was just very stoic about the whole thing. And I was like, oh, are you? You know, but I think that was really good to like, okay, we're seeing this whole thing. And then, yeah, so it was good and it was bad because I couldn't lose it.
Right.
But even if I did, he would understand, like, oh, look, mom loses it sometimes because it's just sad.
It's a great example too, how grief is both a personal and a shared experience. You know, you do your own grieving, but then there are others inevitably involved in the whatever loss, you know. And how much of that do you share and show, and when is feel comfortable doing that or not, and so forth. Um, okay, well let's hit the next slide. I want to let's talk here about I'll call it good grief. Another book I recommend. This is a classic, Ranger Westbrook's Good Grief. You may like to know that Augsburg Publishing, which originally published this, has made more money off of and sold more of the total number of writings by Martin Luther that they published. And a lot of Martin Luther. This has been their cash cow for years. The book every publisher wants to have. Good Grief. It's a great book to give to people in the time of grief, been in print for years and years and years. And you know, he's helping us think about grief can be a good thing. So but this definition comes again from the All Our Losses, All Our Griefs book, that grieving is a process in which deep feelings aroused by the loss are acknowledged and relatively fully expressed. That relatively fully expressed. It's neither possible nor sometimes wise to express everything, you know, to absolute fullness. But when it comes to good grief, let's spend a minute just talking about some of the kinds of losses that may precipitate grief. We already mentioned loss of identity can be one of those things. There's maybe the first thing to say is I think a good grieving is more about, or I should say, less about saying goodbye to things than it is redefining the relationship that you had with whatever it is that was lost. Example, my mother died when I was 26. Was just starting graduate school. She had cancer for a year. I didn't know anything about grief and grieving. I was hopelessly naive and overly stoic at that point, whatever. I headed off to graduate school, not even knowing how to cope with this. I promptly got really sick with a virus because I was just overly stressed and burned out. But about halfway through the year, I started doing some counseling and kind of deal with some of this. About halfway through the year, I had this dream where my mother was in her hospital bed, although the bed was in our living room. You know how it is in dreams. It was weird, you know. And I walked in, and she was like, they're actually looking pretty healthy. And I said something like, Mom, what are you doing here? You're dead. You're not supposed to be here. And she said, and again, this isn't her speak. I don't think this is her speaking to me in the dream. It's me generating dream material that I wasn't fully in touch with. I heard her say in the dream, yeah, I know, but it doesn't mean we can't talk. And I began to realize with some help that, it wasn't about just how to say goodbye. I had to now redefine a relationship. The truth is you only ever have two parents, two biological parents. And so when they die, you have to work to redefine how do I relate to them now that they're not physically here? That's true of anybody that we lose. What's the nature of my relationship? They're still in my memories. They're still in my life. They're still thinking about. I want to tell them, the next thing, and it takes some time to figure out what that's going to be. So um, there are material losses that we have. You may lose a house, it has to be torn down, or if you've anybody ever been robbed or had your car broken into, something like that, not an awful feeling of loss. You're never going to get that back and you feel invaded. That takes some grief work. We can lose a role that we had. That's retirement. You change churches and get a different call. You go from teaching at one school to another, something like that. There are relational losses. People's relationship break up, people get divorced, that kind of thing. And not to overlook, we can lose health and functionality. You're in a serious accident, you lose the loss of a limb, or an illness that now you have to use oxygen or whatever. Working toward naming the loss specifically and then beginning to get in touch with how do I feel about that? I'm not the same person that I used to be. And by the way, in case you haven't noticed, from day one of your life, you're working through a series of losses and changes. All right. I mean, just remember when you first became more aware of yourself as a child, you could now do stuff that you couldn't do when you were just a toddler. And then you became a teenager and you weren't doing the child stuff anymore. You kind of had mixed feelings that some of that stuff was cool, but you now knew at 13 or 14, you probably shouldn't be playing with that kind of, all that sort of thing. So the loss is a permanent part of the growing experience. Let's see, give us another slide there. So yeah, just hit all three of these here. And I just want to go over this again. Good grieving is acknowledging and relatively fully expressing not just the surface feelings, but the deep feelings we have. It's about redefining the relationships that we might have had. And eventually, I think the most important thing, remembering with less pain. Not no pain and not forgetting, but remembering less pain. Okay, give us the next one here. I think, go ahead, play that, please.
The guys I really liked with reading, was remembering with more love, pain. Lots of powerful and a little bit different.
Okay.
We're not just limited in pain, we're
Right.
expanding it.
Should put that in, right.
Yeah.
So remembering
So that's a nice
more love. And how'd you say that again?
remembering with more love.
More love. Yeah. And there will be days when that's easy, and days when that's next to impossible, and you just know that that's normal. So I got the roller coaster thing here just to remind us. I find this is a helpful image for the grieving process. Anybody who thinks that grief work involves a kind of linear progression, I do step A, then I do step B and C, and then I arrive at contentment. Even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's famous 5 stages of death and dying and so forth, she didn't really think that it was a step one step. It was you go through all these in different ways. These are just things that eventually you're probably going to have to work through. And so I think the roller coaster idea that sometimes it's a slow slog and it doesn't feel like you're making any progress as you inch up to the top, and then all of a sudden the bottom falls out. That feeling when you're right at the top and it's like your stomach drops out, and stuff can hit you, and then there are bumps along the way, and sometimes it feels like you're totally upside down. The point being, the grief process is is immoderate. And what that means is it's not just, a little bit building on itself each day. It's intense, and then it's like, this seems like a normal day. Maybe I'm through it. No, next day, anything can happen. So it's going to take time. Most people I've talked to suggest that for a really significant loss, 2 years is about what it takes. Most folks with most good therapists, I don't know what your take is on this, but usually don't encourage people to make major decisions in their life the first year after a really significant loss. Give yourself a chance to get through the first Christmas, the first anniversary, the first birthday, the first time when you're not going to the shore for vacation together or whatever. By the second year, things, although immoderately, generally are starting to move forward. If you find somebody's still really stuck after about 5 years, get the professionals involved, because that's now we've got a real serious situation.
I was gonna say the most telling or most the best advice I got that really rested with me, if you will, was in the first year, don't do the things the same way.
Yeah.
Don't do Christmas the same way. Go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Go to somebody else's house. Go out. Just do not do the commemorations the same way.
I think that's part of the redefining relationships. You can hold sacred those memories that you had from that, but I'm going to move life, inch it forward a little bit here, and try something different. Yeah. And it may be after a few years you'll want to revive some of those old things, but yeah, good advice, I think. Well, the last thing on here is that just to remember, the only normal thing about grief is that it's abnormal. That it's not the same for everybody, and normality is, if you know that it's going to go up and down and flip you sideways, and some days are going to feel great, other days you're going to feel terrible. That is, you're not going crazy, and that's not weird. That's normal in the wake of a significant loss. And if you can accept the normality of the abnormality. So I think the grieving process in many ways is just learning how to ride the roller coaster and get somewhat comfortable. I don't know if you really like roller coasters, maybe that helps. I don't know. See. Okay. Let's go to another slide here quick. I'm not going to read all these things. This comes from a friend therapist of mine. The factors that can influence the way that the loss hits us, that impacts us. There's so many things that can play into this. Some are more important for us than others. Just you can read through them and see what you think here. Anything in particular strike you on that list? Either that you resonate with or might have questions about?
Judy is my spouse before I lost my mother. I the hard thing about losing my mom was really that she was the only that took two people really,
Mhm.
you need that. That's what was so hard for me. They certainly, I'm sure that my grief with Judy, which was total and complete, I just gave myself over to it, helped me, and was fact my mom's with me through.
That becomes a multiple loss, and sometimes that can hit really hard. A death happens right at the same time as a job loss or something, or several people die at the same time. And even if it's been a length of time, it's still you haven't kind of got your footing from the first loss, and now get another one to cope with. And let me just hit the fourth bullet up from the bottom there. the coping skills that we have prior to a loss will have an impact. If you have relatively good coping skills for dealing with hard things, those will probably be there to come into play for you. If you didn't have much support or capacity to cope, you're not suddenly going to, be able to do it better. So all of life that's led up to the loss is going to play into how that hits us and how we express grief and so forth. But let's go to the next slide because this really deserves. Okay, don't hit it again. So how many times have we all wanted to throw up when in the wake of a tragedy, we see some CNN reporter sticking a microphone in somebody's face after the school shooting and saying, what's it going to take for you to get closure on this? Right?
Punch him in the neck.
Closure is a fallacy. We are trying to get to a point of remembering with more love and less pain, redefining relationship. Closure is not the point. Okay, so here's an illustration I hope to demonstrate that. So go ahead and hit the first one, Dave. Okay, when a significant loss first happens, it feels like that loss is squeezing out every bit of space in our life box, right? It's occupying everything. It's even pushing out the edges. There's no time or energy to think about anything or to deal with any other thing other than I just got fired, my spouse left me, the house burned down, somebody died. Now, the idea that, time takes care of everything, that notion suggests that, well, over time, that loss is going to shrink down and get smaller and smaller. I want to say, now, the loss is still going to be the loss, and it is not going to shrink. What's going to happen, however, go ahead and hit the next slide, is if we work a grief process, we can help our life to expand so that the loss takes up less space. The loss is still the loss. It's always going to be there, but we work at expanding our life as you were suggesting, you try some new things, different traditions and whatnot. You gently move forward. And it just hit the next couple that, and over time, hopefully, the loss doesn't diminish, it gets smaller, but life can expand. So it's a little bit of an optical illusion. It kind of looks like the loss is getting smaller, but in fact, life is getting larger and expanding, that takes some effort. And again, it's not linear. It doesn't mean to suggest that every day in every way it's getting, bigger or better. But eventually, we hope to be able to get to that point. Does that make sense? Or have you encountered that kind of an idea before?
It's good to have people who love you around you too. Because my cousin David actually moved in with me for a week after my mom died. And it was drink this, eat that, take a shower, go to bed. I mean, and he was very no nonsense about it. He wasn't like, oh, you poor thing.
Yeah, okay.
He was like, you haven't eaten, have a sandwich.
Somebody to just do common sense with you. I think maybe the most helpful pastoral advice I got in the wake of my father's death, father died on Ash Wednesday, so every Ash Wednesday I revisit that. It was exactly 30 years ago this year. Our funeral director, family friend who has done all the funerals for everybody in our family, said to my sisters and to me, and we were now orphaned and neither parent there. He said, I always try to remind people, walk, don't run. And I took from that and stayed with me. You have to put one foot in front of the other and move on. You don't have to try to run and get everything done. He said, you're going to be tempted in the next couple of weeks to get everything done and, all the paperwork and insurance and deal with the house and on. Stuff I didn't realize when my mother had died, that I was frantic about trying to help my father do everything. Don't run. It's dangerous. It's like you tell children, don't, you got scissors in your hand, don't run. You're dealing with significant loss, don't try to run because you'll crash. but you do need to walk. Just gently take one step and keep going. I think that's really, really helpful and insightful. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Enough on that stuff. Just to name some types of grief, and then we'll take a few minutes and talk about some how to maybe suggestions on how to do a grieving process. We already mentioned some of these, that ambivalent grief, that it's possible to have joy and sadness at the same time. You celebrate the life that was lived, but there were some bumps that you never got worked out or reconciled. That could be a complicating factor. Um, it, it, ambiguous grief. This is, I had mentioned a while ago, a significant loss or a change that does not involve a death. Divorce can be the archetype here in some ways. I've heard people say, that divorce seems almost harder than death because somewhere out there, this other person still exists. And if you're in a small town arena, you may bump into them in the grocery store. What are you going to do about your church life in the wake of that, and so forth? How do you deal with a loss when the person is still out there somewhere? And that could be any sort of estrangement. You have a falling out with somebody. It's not the ambiguity of that can be really painful. And then anticipatory grief, all those cluster of normal human emotions that you feel in the wake of a loss can also be experienced as you inch toward a loss. The diagnosis may come of a terminal illness, and that unless some kind of medical miracle happens, you may only have a few months. Some people are already working through that stuff in advance, or who knows, whatever else we may anticipate. I mean, have you had that experience? Does that make sense? Yeah, because
Well, I'm a bit of a Boy Scout. I did the be prepared on that.
okay,
And I feel like I grieved my dad's death before he died
Mhm.
because I could see that it's coming.
yeah,
And so I had harder times. After he died, there was a lot of uncertainty. I thought, well, I was ready for this. Well,
Yeah.
what do I do now? So yeah, anticipatory grief.
Yeah.
It was
That's one of the hardest, well, dementia's a big one too,
yeah, thank you.
because it's lots of not little, but progressive losses over time
Accumulate.
that accumulate, because now, depending on the diagnosis or whatever, now, this person doesn't remember, that their short-term memory is gone, and then you're going back a little bit farther, and you're going back a little farther. Now they've lost this bit of who they are. So there's progressive mourning of that relationship, and it just keeps going. So that's extremely significant. And as you were saying, one of the things that I counsel people that I'm working is that when you're dealing with someone who is on hospice, technically we're all terminal.
Yeah.
Okay, we're all terminal. So it's just that the people that have a terminal diagnosis have a better idea of what their timeline is than the rest of us, right? So as long as you have breath in your lungs and your heart is beating, you are alive. So it's so emotionally just draining to think, is today the day? Is it now? You cannot go, you really have to guard against that. Like, going into a situation, is today the day? Today is the day that I'm going to walk in, and whatever happens, happens. And she's awake, and sweet, let's do this. We're not, tomorrow may be different, but today it's really learning how to live at the moment. Otherwise, you're just absolutely draining yourself. And it's catastrophic. It's really, really hard. Because then you've been mourning and grieving all this time. And then you're right, when you finally does happen, now what? But there's still more to process.
Yeah.
Because you've been grieving, but you've been still working, doing the things, and yeah, that's
And
hard.
sometimes anticipating the relief of finally getting out from under this, and then you finding out a whole other hassle of emotional things to deal with. But thanks for mentioning the dementia. That can be a super significant loss that is like slow torture over time. You watch someone slipping when you're losing a relationship, you watch someone losing their sense of identity. Uh, and it's immoderate as it's one day you thought, oh, I can talk to mom. And the next day it's just nothing there. It can be really hard. Um, don't want to forget to mention COVID as an example of, you know, you just don't have enough time to deal with, you've got to deal with stuff, all the stuff we were trying to do. As we've learned, COVID may be over, but we're still living in its realities. And so, and other things can happen too. A death can happen in the midst of a child being born, you're moving, you're relocating, whatever. And the grief has to be just pushed off in time a bit. Um, what I mentioned before, inhibited grief, our own limitations can complicate grief. We're just not good at dealing with our feelings or identifying. Okay, well, so you're not. I mean, that's going to make it a little more complicated. Um, uh, or you don't have people around to support and whatever. And then it's, sometimes the losses just come. I mean, people say things happen in threes or whatever, just you can have several things all at once that really can accumulate. Okay, let's go to the last slide. Just couple minutes on this. And just run them all out here. I got this model from a bathroom at Children's Hospital some years ago, and we'll just if we take 5 minutes. We can just process this together. This is one model. There are others, but maybe to help us think how to do the good grief kind of work. The first thing is it's important to name the loss. So I just want you don't have to share anything here, but just think about this. I'll guide us through it. Think about a significant loss that you've experienced. It may be a person. It might be some tangible artifact that you lost. It could be the loss of a role or the end of an experience that you had. Can you get that in focus and name it? And then conjure up an early recollection of the thing that you lost. A first memory of a person, that place, that thing, that experience, whatever that may be. And then, whenever it may have happened, a humorous time. Nancy mentioned some of that. And I think no matter how bad a relationship was, there's usually something that was funny that you can recall, or maybe it was just a place that you're never going to be able to go back to, but it's really a funny thing that happened. I mean, can you get in touch with the humor? But then also a serious time. A family member, for instance, we may have had very humorous time, but there were times when things got really serious. However you would define serious, I mean, that could be different for everybody, of course. And then, really important, can we land on an angry time that we had with whatever loss we had? Lost a pet, probably funny time, probably serious times, and there were probably times you just wanted to strangle it, or ran away or whatever, things like that. And people make us angry, circumstances make us angry. That's a step in process where we make sure we land. We're not denying, that stuff did make us angry. And remember that anger is always caused by a sense of hurt. We only get angry when we feel like something has hurt. So what we're really saying here is time when you felt hurt because of whatever this was that was lost. And then, flip that over, an experience of awe. And I had this person in my life, and I can't believe what an amazing person they were. Or, I grew up on a farm that doesn't exist anymore. Now it's a strip mall, but I remember being out there in the field, or whatever, was awesome. Last piece might be then a gift that you receive from a person. Might be grandma gave me her ring, or a coworker gave me something, or it was just a piece of advice that I got from so and so, or it was just a gift to be in that place. I find this to be really helpful, and once or twice or 99 times through this won't necessarily get you all the way to remembering with the more love and less pain, but it's important. In fact, I have heard some people say 100 times to remember the experience of the loss and work through some things like this will get you close to the kind of good grief that will help you move on with life. So this isn't linear. Doesn't mean you start with one thing and do something else, but touching base on those basic thoughts, I think, can be really useful. Any reactions to this, just as you tried to think about that and process it?
To me, it doesn't turn, if it's a person, it doesn't turn the person into a hero or an idiot.
Yeah.
I mean, to balance, to just sort of see the whole of the person. So I think sometimes the loss, it can go either extreme.
That's good insight. Not all funny, not all serious. We're always angry. Sometimes we're not.
That's sort of the objection I have with obituaries.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
It's the greatest present on life.
Yeah.
On birth, the greatest smile, always. And I'm going, oh, I don't come close to this. I just,
uh, well, if you've ever preached a funeral sermon,
Oh, I'm taking him into heaven, we used to talk about. It's like,
Well, I hope that, especially in the third week, we can
kicking it.
we can say a word or two about obituaries and the role they play in the rituals that we have in terms of coming to terms with death. Do you want to say a word about next week and what we can expect?
3 years ago.
I haven't written the next.
All right. Well, what are you gonna bring?
I reference it.
That's okay.
Next week, we are talking about the role of end of life doulas in the dying process. And I know, like, a year ago, I came to you like, I'm a newly minted doula,
Yeah.
and now I have a year under my belt and maybe have some wisdom, but also about what physically happens to you as your body shuts down from a layperson's point of view. I'm not a doctor or a nurse or anything like that, but just a general overview, because it's icky and we don't want to talk about it, but therefore it's scary. If things you don't understand, then you're scared about it. And so the more you know, theoretically, the less you can be scared, that you would be scared about. So that's kind of what we're doing, right?
Yeah,
That's what you want.
One of the books on the handout by Sherwin Newland, who is the doctor, called How We Die. He has like 6 chapters on the most common ways that people expire: heart disease, cancer, traumatic injuries, that kind of thing. I think is somewhat helpful along these lines. But enough said on that point.
But also, like, if you
Yeah.
want to, there's on your reading list, there's books by Caitlin Doty, like Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs? Another question about dead bodies, Smoke Gets You in Your Eyes, and Other Lessons from the Crematory, and From Here to Eternity, Traveling the World to Find the Good Death. This is more, I guess, for like week 3, but she is a crematory operator, a funeral operator, funeral home operator, and she writes with humor, but gives you lots of facts, which I find very intriguing and engaging. So if you ever wondered about if your cat will eat your eyeballs, or what would happen if you swallowed a bag of popcorn before you died and were cremated, you will. That's a question. That's something I would want to know. Check those out because you get information, but in a funny way.
Well, that's a good place to land, and I'll leave us with one last thought from Carl Rogers, who I mentioned. He was also famous for saying, "The facts are friendly," and it's better, he thought, to know the facts than to ignore the facts. So things like this that we may seem weird or unpleasant or whatever, it's generally helpful to know something about what we're up against. And so we hope, especially next week's conversation, will help us become more familiar with things that maybe we're not so familiar or comfortable with.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you then.